When looking back on World War II, nearly all historians and analysts agree that the defeat of Nazi Germany was crucial in shaping the modern world. Still, from time to time, a hypothetical question arises. What if Nazi Germany had won humanity's most brutal conflict? Would the world truly have become a worse place? Or is that merely an unfounded fear? To explore the answer, let us envision an alternate historical scenario, considering the ideological aspect, the imposition of power, and the long-term effects on global society and culture if Nazi Germany had not lost. One must first clarify what a German victory would mean. In a frequently proposed scenario, Germany successfully invades and subjugates Britain, instead of being repelled in the Battle of Britain, forces the Soviet Union to surrender on the Eastern Front after Moscow and key industrial centers fall, and prevents the United States from deploying large forces to Europe. Under such conditions, Germany would dominate most of continental Europe and gain access to vast resources in northeastern Eurasia. Thus, Hitler and his power apparatus would be free to implement their extreme ideological policies on an unprecedented scale. The ideological foundation of Nazi Germany rested on extreme nationalism, a belief in the Aryan master race, and a desire to expand living space, Lebensraum for Germans. Historically, millions of Jews, Slavs, Romani, and numerous other ethnic or political groups were oppressed and killed. The Holocaust was a horrific example of where that thinking led. Had Germany been victorious, all measures directed against Jews and Slavs, along with various social purification programs, might have proceeded more thoroughly, extending across Europe and potentially beyond. First and foremost, one must acknowledge Nazi racial policy. Based on historical documents and more public statements by Hitler and his associates, the thousand-year Reich they aspired to create always included the goal of eliminating, enslaving, or eradicating peoples not deemed part of a pure Aryan race. In reality, they committed genocide against Jews and Romani and brutally oppressed Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe. If they had won, the scale of such purges could have been even larger and more prolonged. Concentration camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Bergen-Belsen, which had existed in reality, might have become a permanent model to oversee and deal with any unwanted groups. The so-called final solution would likely have been pushed to greater extremes, targeting not only Jews, but also Poles, Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and countless other ethnicities Hitler labeled inferior. The consequences for human civilization would have been catastrophic, devastating Europe's, indeed, much of the world's cultural, intellectual, and social diversity. Next, should Nazi Germany have emerged victorious, one could foresee the formation of a new political structure spanning most of continental Europe, extending east to the Urals or further. Within that territory, the German Reich, ruled by Hitler or his successors, would impose a fascist governing model. A single-party system, rigid media control, and the use of the Gestapo and SS to quash dissent would become standard. Political parties, democratic organizations, or free media would be unthinkable. If Britain were conquered, it might be placed under a puppet regime, while the royal family could be deposed or bound tightly to Berlin. Regions such as France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and others, if not outright annexed, would be controlled harshly and drained of resources to feed Germany's war machine, its industrial demands, and its expansionist ambitions. Hitler even spoke of erasing major cities like Moscow or Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, turning them into empty zones for German settlements. This large-scale resettlement and genocide would transform a vast swath of Eastern Europe, from Poland and Ukraine all the way to the Caucasus, into new living space for the Aryan race. Economically speaking, the Nazis aimed for an autarkic system, exploiting occupied territories for raw materials, food, and labor. Had they succeeded, many European countries, and potentially regions in Africa or the Middle East if Germany continued to expand, would have been turned into raw material sources and manufacturing bases for Berlin. This would have stifled the global economy. Once free market competition was wiped out, industries would primarily exist to meet wartime needs and enforce social control, leaving minimal room for innovation or technological advancement. In reality, post-war years saw a boom in science and technology, from electronics and information systems to medicine and space exploration. In a world dominated by Nazi Germany, however, such progress would likely be crushed or misdirected. Any new technology, if developed, would probably focus on surveillance, weaponry, or tools of genocide. Independent scientific talent and intellectual freedom would be suppressed or destroyed, especially among groups deemed undesirable. Another factor to consider: if Germany completely won in Europe, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union, in this scenario, perhaps forced into a truce akin to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty of World War I, might simply accept Germany as the sole dominant power. The world could be drawn into an even more intense period of division, one pole being Nazi Germany, Italy, Japan, if Japan continued its success in Asia, and another being the US or a weakened remnant Soviet Union retaining a portion of its Far East territory. The resulting dynamic might lead to a variant of the Cold War, potentially far harsher than the actual one between the US and the USSR. Since the fascist bloc made no secret of its intent to subjugate other peoples, the US might feel compelled to fortify its military at all costs, potentially resorting to nuclear arms earlier to counter the threat from Berlin. Under such circumstances, the world would deteriorate not only in terms of human rights and freedoms, but also due to a heightened risk of nuclear conflict. Germany's expertise in rocketry, combined with the vast resources it would wield as continental Europe's ruler, would allow it to develop far-reaching missiles and possibly nuclear weapons. If a nuclear arms race erupted with the US in the late 1940s or early 1950s under extreme fascist ideology, the potential for cataclysmic nuclear war would loom large. Another serious consequence would be the demise of democracy. Had Germany occupied the major democracies of Europe, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and the Nordic countries, there would be little chance of their restoration. Fascism in power would mean trampling elections, free press, and freedom of thought. Humanity would lose the intellectual impetus that inspires movements in philosophy, culture, and the arts. Many intellectuals, artists, and writers would be forced into exile or face punishment. The flourishing of artistic and cultural movements that, in reality, found haven in the US or lands outside German control might be severely constricted. The brain drain seen in the 1933 to 1945 period, where many fled to the US, might never occur because Western doors could be slammed shut. As a result, countless intangible values, modern literary and artistic work, and humanist philosophies would risk destruction or distortion by fascist standards. Assuming Germany controlled nearly all of Europe, efforts by fringe nations like Turkey, Sweden, or Switzerland, or guerrilla movements to overthrow such a regime would probably be inadequate. Nonetheless, that does not imply all resistance would vanish. Throughout history, many peoples have shown an enduring will to remain independent. Hence, this scenario could involve prolonged internal strife, periodic rebellions, and harsher crackdowns. In actual history, Germany's defeat enabled Europe to rebuild and move toward integration, eventually leading to the European Union. Conversely, if Hitler had imposed his new order, the continent would likely sink into internal instability or entrenched totalitarianism. The advanced Europe of the post-war era, committed to democracy and human rights, would never emerge. Consequently, not only Europe but the entire world would be deprived of this democratic haven that helped foster numerous social and political reforms. Naturally, when constructing a hypothetical scenario, one must acknowledge unpredictable historical variables. Might a future revolution erupt within Nazi-dominated Europe? Could internal divisions eventually topple Hitler? Would the US, faced with such a formidable rival, remain a fortress of freedom for others? Nevertheless, given what we know of Hitler's racist ideology, the SS and Gestapo's ruthlessness, and the oppressive management of occupied territories, it is difficult to conceive of a less brutal outcome. If victorious, the Nazis would only strengthen their grip on power, enabling even more widespread implementation of their genocidal ambitions. Meanwhile, global civilization would likely be suffocated under oppressive political and social frameworks, preventing the flourishing of human rights, equality, and tolerance. On balance, a scenario in which Nazi Germany triumphs in World War II would almost certainly produce a worse world, particularly in terms of humanitarian values, human rights, freedom of thought, and cultural diversity. Instead of a post-1945 global order founded on democracy and human rights, we might see a planet riddled with totalitarian regimes, ubiquitous secret police, and genocidal campaigns of incalculable devastation. Furthermore, the scientific, technological, and cultural milestones achieved in the decades after the war might never materialize, or, if they did, could be stunted and manipulated by fascist rule. The lack of competition, freedom of knowledge exchange, and creative liberty would hinder humanity's progress. Other nations, the US, a capitulating Britain, or a partially intact Soviet Union, might be forced into perpetual military expansion, risking economic crises, nuclear stalemates, or endless regional wars. Nevertheless, history records the defeat of Nazi Germany and its Axis allies, Italy, Japan, as a critical turning point for humanity. Reflecting on how much worse things might have been had the Axis powers prevailed, makes it clearer why World War II and the Allied victory are seen as key in establishing today's international framework. That victory not only eliminated a sinister ideology, but also inspired reconstruction efforts grounded in peace, human rights, and collective progress. Had events taken another course, those values may never have found the chance to blossom and endure.